Welcome to the Writer's Voice Cafe in Provincetown. And we're very happy to see you here. And Nappy has just arrived. We want to thank Nappy! Thank you so much, Nappy and Helen, for giving us this wonderful space. Thank you so much. This is our 4th season. This is the end of our 4th season here. So next year is our 5th, and we really do appreciate the support.
Is this the last program?
You're not going to meet in June?
Yes.
No, this is near the end. No, we have one more. We have, in June, we have 2 poets as our featured writers, Hildy Olson and Dennis Rhodes. So we have one more time in June. So we're excited about that. Welcome. Our featured writer for tonight is Antonio Diaz. He is an artist, designer, writer living in southern New England. Raised on a beach overlooking Provincetown, he has built on early experiences there and in Down East Maine for his 2 novels in manuscript. Shoal Hope, a novel of Provincetown before World War I, and Something for Nothing, a novel of Provincetown, Prohibition, and the aftermath of war. He has recently returned to painting and continues to keep his hand in designing wooden boats while writing essays for his blog, horizonsofsignificance.wordpress.com, and posting poetry at antoniodiazpoetry.wordpress.com. And without further ado, Antonio Tony Diaz, please give it up.
So, thank you, Diane. Thank you all for coming, and thanks for your introduction and for welcoming me to the Writer's Voice Cafe. Tonight I'll be reading from my 2 Provincetown novels, Shoal Hope and Something for Nothing. The chapter called Peter, from Something for Nothing, is going to be published in mid-June as part of the Dark Mountain 2 anthology in Britain. I'm going to read that in its entirety, but before I do that, I'd like to describe some of the circumstances that led to writing these novels, and introduce some of the characters with a few short excerpts. My mother will be 95 next month, still summers on Beach Point, where I grew up. During a visit in 2002, standing in Loeb Square, I was struck by an epiphany. This was at the height of the post-9/11 frenzy, when the country appeared caught up in a closed-off and fearful, a hate-filled mood. It felt as if paranoia and suspicion were everywhere. Standing in Loeb Square, I was infused by a different atmosphere here. Here was a haven of tolerance in a world growing to be dominated by fear and hatred. This place has always been like this, in ways more significant than we might credit. In a world where to be serious is to shout for war and demand ever greater repressions, Provincetown has long been considered a joke, a charming sideshow at best. It struck me that this was upside down. I could tell stories that might change those perceptions. At least I could celebrate what I found so special about this place. That's when I started writing Shoal Hope. I've long been drawn to the years just before World War I as a major turning point in history. My father was born on the day of Queen Victoria's funeral. I was a child here in the 50s and built boats in tiny Down East Maine communities in the 70s. I've studied painting. These make a scattered resume, but they led me to believe I could write about Provincetown in 1912 as if from my own memories. They always say, write what you know, and in a strange way I felt I knew this place and that time. On Gosnold's voyage in 1602, Gabriel Archer wrote, "We had again sight of the land, which made ahead, being as we thought an island. We called it Shoal Hope. Near this came this cape we came to anchor in 15 fathoms, where we took a great store of codfish, for which we altered the name and called it Cape Cod. Shoal Hope, the prologue. In Archer's telling, a point of land passed from a Shoal Hope to Cape Cod within a single breath of its first naming. There'd been something significant in that original intuition, as important as the elemental hunger that led to its abandonment, a value in describing it as a Shoal Hope that was lost when displaced by a pragmatic advertisement of profit. Yet over the centuries, as many people have sought to discover some ineffable sense of life here as ever went after its spoils. It could be said that this cape has always existed somewhere between these two views, in a moment of expectation, wonder, confusion, and doubt. In this place, there's persisted an attitude as useful as it may have been difficult to maintain amidst an ebb and flow, between shifting certainties and growing doubts, an attempt to balance hope with necessity. Chapter 1, Railroad Wharf. Joe C. bent over an engine block, half in, half out of the cuddy in the stern of the trap boat Nellie and Mary. She was tied up in a sliver of open water under the fish house at the end of Railroad Wharf, tied between draggers crammed 3 abreast. The long arc of Provincetown Harbor gradually shelved from the shore. The wharf extended almost a quarter of a mile to reach deep water at low tide. Narrow and spindly as the tide fell, its tarred pilings jutted a dozen feet out of the water. Chapter 11, Small's Hollow. Stevie's mother, Sally Small, worked a farm on the highlands between Pilgrim Spring and High Head. They grew asparagus, corn, and strawberries. The train hauled their surplus produce to Boston. She had a chicken house. A dairy cow was stabled in a swayback little barn. Chapter 12, Dune Walk. Snow fell in big, fat, flat flakes out of a pewter sky. Early afternoon felt like dusk. Stevie lowered his head. A cap of snow on his hair slipped forward. The scrunch squish of his footfalls across snow-covered sand resonated in his ears. The dunes were still. There was no wind. Snowflakes spiraled down and landed all around him, registered in his skull like shattering slivers of glass. A flake landed on his nose, a powerful sensation, an exploding pop wet against his warm skin. Ben had begun to cry as they had first raised their voices. Her slap brought an answering shriek from him as though he'd been struck. He continued to wail. The sound tore through her as the first touch of cold air reached her from the open doorway. "Eliza, shut the door," she said in a low, affectless tone. She relaxed her shoulders willfully. She picked Ben up off the floor, his arms thrust high, pleading for her neck. She hoisted her strapping toddler as though he were an infant. Hitching herself, she translated his weight to her hip, hugging him close, patting his back in time with his sobs, cooing for him to relax, losing herself in 16 years of child-rearing routine, finding respite in maternal love, this her duty to her last, youngest child. The girls crossed to the doorway together. They stood side by side looking out. Their brother had already passed out of sight over the hummock. His bare footprints tracked across the sandy yard and rose, disappearing through the cleft. Sand and snow lay in a thickening blanket of ivory and white, dotted by dark scrub. "Come on now, close the door," she urged them gently, turning a circle in the middle of the room, her eyes taking in the walls, the cupboards, the table, chairs, stove, her wash rack. Cooing into Ben's ear, she felt herself relax into him. She drained herself of emotion, of will. Ben began to weigh on her, the fresh cool of the room, washing still to be hung, still in its basket, supper to prepare, called her back. Something for Nothing takes us through the year 1927. These quotations will set the tone. The Great Gatsby, Fitzgerald, 1925. Gatsby believed in the green light, the orgiastic future that year by year recedes before us. It eluded us then, but no matter. Tomorrow we will run faster, stretch out our arms farther. So we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. Barbara Tuchman from the Guns of August. He died on a field in Lorraine where at the end of the day, August 20, 1914, nothing was visible but corpses strewn in rows and sprawled in awkward attitudes of sudden death as if the place had been swept by a malignant hurricane. It was one of those lessons a survivor realized afterwards by which God teaches the law to kings. Okay, so now I want to read in its entirety chapter 24, Peter, from Something for Nothing. This is the piece that's going to be published next month. Some nights, when the surf angled in just right and the tide was high enough for the waves to break close in on the slope of the beach, the pounding waves sounded like distant artillery fire. When that happened, he awoke drenched in cold sweat, not knowing why. He stayed out at the old life-saving station anyway. He'd gone out there at first thinking he'd last a few weeks, and that had turned into months. Its bohemian owners had gone back to the city for the winter, so no one bothered him much as the season had closed in. He liked the clean, open emptiness it gave his days, at least when the sun was out. This was even more so late in the fall like this, when the low sun bounced off the hills of sand and the vibrant blue vault of sky ached in his head. It was better than being in town. No one bothered him out here. In town, he felt hedged in. Everyone seemed to know his business. Out here, he did what he wanted, or nothing at all, spending whole days on the weathered, sand-blasted stoop, shifting to stay in the warmth of the sun as it arced around, smoking and staring at the horizon. He found he'd longed for this for so long, just to be. The mad rush of life stilled for once. He'd lose himself, not in thought, but in simple sensation. He found that a morning would melt away, an afternoon, the early dusk, would close in around him, and only as the air took a more pronounced chill did he realize that he'd been sitting there all day. Other times he'd walk. He'd find himself back at the station late, a waxing moon rising across the dunes, and have no idea where he'd gone. Sitting, walking, simply breathing the thin, cool air seemed to him at those times to be enough. More than enough, as if this were sufficient for life, to simply let it wash over him quietly without shocks or surprises. It wasn't bright and sunny every day. More and more, days wouldn't dawn so much as groan into existence, the deepest darkness of an overcast night on the back shore, slowly lifting as he could make out the window frame, then the horizon. Not sharp and dancing far away like it did on a bright day, but close in, barely perceptible. The gray of water met the gray of sky and melted into a unified cocoon, a blanket, as the dull, soft sand below reflected its monotony, only broken by startlingly erotic clumps of dark beach grass perched atop some hummock, a mons of dune. The closeness of such days, even that vague call towards sex tugging at him, even as he buried it, led him to irritation. He'd fuss and find that everything about the place, inside and out, annoyed him. He was low on food. The lantern oil can was empty. The books he had with him bored him. He was out of tobacco and papers and matches. He'd find himself trudging off towards town, grudgingly welcoming its hassles as he began to meet people. Its low buildings and houses shut off the far horizon. Tall, narrow strips of distance showed between, lost without detail in the glare of contrast with the dark walls that shut him in. He would wander the town, wrap himself in a shell of frustration, ignore everyone he passed, daring anyone to break into his day. If he met up with someone he knew, he stared right past them and kept walking. He almost believed himself that he hadn't noticed as old friends or passing acquaintances stopped and stared after him, shaking their heads. At a lunch counter, in a shop, he'd push his way through, affecting annoyance at the bustle and contact of others, but wincing in mixed pleasure and pain at the accidental pressure of another body against him. By the end of the day, he'd have haphazardly attended to his errands and be back to the station before dark. His larder restocked, plenty to smoke and drink, and a new book from the library or a paper or magazine on his bedside table to tempt him with glimpses of a world beyond the sound of wind and rain and sea. The last time he'd been to town, it hadn't been a particularly dreary day. A steady, sharp wind out of the northwest blew across a cluttered sky as clouds shifted past. There was a different feeling about the town as he entered. People seemed preoccupied. Passing a storefront, he noticed the headlines on a Boston paper in oversized Gothic typeface, hard to read. Something about a submarine, trapped sailors, a collision. The most startling thing about it all, in a strange way, was seeing the name Provincetown in that tall type with all the rest. A byline in the Boston Globe, Provincetown. The entire town appeared caught up in a story of stricken sailors. Walking along Front Street, Peter caught fragments of conversation as he strode along, one hand deep in his jacket pocket, the other balled in a fist, pumping. The scar on his thigh ached. On almost every step, the muscle around it pulled. It felt as if to tear around the shard of shrapnel buried there. He half welcomed the pain, faithful at least. It never left him. It gave him a place to focus his anger. So much burned in him, it was good to have a place to put it all. He smoked as he walked, a hand-rolled cigarette firmly held between his thumb and two fingers, like a pencil or a brush. His breath often caught in a wheeze. He coughed and kept on walking, just a little too fast. He brought his cigarette up to his lips and took another sharp, deep drag, suppressing the urge to cough, holding the smoke an extra beat, to prove to himself that he could. The meeting at the town hall had been a farce. He'd been drawn to the commotion as he headed up the street. It dawned on him why the streets had seemed so empty. A small crowd trailed from its main entrance down the steps and out towards the street. Some of the side windows were open despite the cold, as if to let out the furor within. He could tell without making out the words that this crowd wasn't happy. Without thinking, he'd found himself entering. Hit by the noise and the crush, he pushed his way through to a spot by a window. Passing the doors, swung open to the lobby, pushing in from under the overhanging balcony. He saw that the entire shallow vaulted space was full. Everyone talking, a loud, angry buzz. On a narrow stage stood a podium, flags ranged to one side, and some military men stood in a line. He made out two men who caught his attention, a younger, tall officer dressed, what, as a captain? He wasn't too sure how to read the ranks in the Navy, never had been. The other was short, older, obviously senior. He pieced together the gist of what was going on. A submarine had been struck. Revenuers? Perfect, he thought. They've got nothing better to do. The Navy had arrived in force, tugs, a salvage ship. Some sailors were still alive on the submarine, yet the rescue flotilla had returned to port after a first diver had made contact. When was that? Yesterday, he wondered? He wasn't sure. It might have been a couple of days ago already. Christ, they've been down there how long? That fucking admiral or whatever he is. He looked across at the older man standing at the lectern, who was paternally explaining why the Navy couldn't do anything so long as it was so stormy. Condescending bastard, Peter muttered. The old man looked like he was addressing some ladies' lawn party, not a hall filled to the rafters with fishermen and their families, men who knew a lot more about storms than he ever would. I'm afraid we had to break off diving operations yesterday, the senior officer intoned in a faint drawl. Until the weather improves, we won't be able to send anyone back down. Peter stood at the side, leaning against the wall, directly below one of the tall windows. The hall seethed as the officer spoke. Here and there, louder disturbances broke out. A stout, red-faced Portuguese stood up. His hands grasped his braces as if to contain himself. The skin on his knuckles was drawn tight and white against his red flannel shirt. We net your submarine. We haul it to the beach. is so close to shore. Oh, meu Deus. His words exploding from him were answered by a roar of agreement. The Admiral took a half step backwards, his hands clutching the podium for support. His gaze traveled around the hall, over the heads of all those standing at their seats on the main floor, and below the eyes of those in the balcony, leaning over its edge as if the space couldn't contain them. The golden glow of polished wood and the living crowd that filled the hall set the space vibrating. It felt like a giant violin, the hall, both the site of a performance and its instrument. The Admiral's face waxed a shade paler than his normal office-bound pallor. He turned to his side, looking at the officer in charge of dive operations. He gritted his teeth, and for a second, Peter saw all the bureaucrat's anger focused on that man. "It's always the way," he muttered aloud as he walked, remembering. He'd had to leave. He felt he'd explode otherwise, walking down the street again, fury in his low voice palpable. "It's always the fucking way." Heads turned around him in alarm. He ignored them, caught up reliving events at the hall. He walked on, balling up this new anger and his frustration, adding them to his long list of examples of military fuck-ups he'd seen in the war. Generals fart and men die. It never changes. He kicked at a wadded paper sack in the street. "What am I doing back here anyway?" he blurted, turning his thoughts to his own problems. He could see those 6 sailors huddled below, not knowing, or knowing, but not ready to accept it. Once, on the front, after a 24-hour barrage, he and his men had come out of a bunker in time to catch the last trickle of faint light bleed out of the western sky. None of them had believed they'd ever see the sky again. The sight of it hurt, not its brightness. Acetylene torches lighting that pit had been brighter, sharp, hard stabs of light without color, hissing like serpents, accentuating the gloom with their barely contained violence. They'd been constantly assailed by premonitions of the instant when a direct hit would break in on them, tongues of flame and tons of earth engulfing them, incinerating and entombing them faster than they could imagine. Those lights had been a focus for their fears as they repeatedly imagined what their deaths would feel like. That's what they'd expected would happen. Not to come out into the dying day alive, or were they? What hurt them most was their numbness. They'd spent a night and a day building it up, wrapping themselves in its protection like so many bandages. Bandages not meant to protect a physical wound, but intended to protect them from hope, from even the last vestige, the last torn scrap of it. Fear and hope had begun to feel like the same thing to them after a while, mere irritations they felt across their skins and deep within their bodies. A jangle of raw nerves. It stopped mattering if it came from a moment of terror at the proximity of a near miss or a moment of respite, an insinuating glimmer of hope that welled up when a lull or a wide miss gave them a vague sense of gratitude that they'd been spared that time. They'd been spared, but what about the poor bastards it had hit? Next time, it might be our turn. He knew too much about what it must be like down there. "Give it up, boys," he said tenderly as he lit another cigarette. He pinched out the dying match between his thumb and finger, enjoying the tiny blast of pain and exploding bee sting as he wished them well and dead. Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions or thoughts or? Yes.
Do you do research, and if so, what types of material do you use to gather your background?
Mm-hmm. Well, yes, I've read quite a bit of history. Actually, Something for Nothing, a lot of it has to do with the sinking of the S-4 in 1927, and I've been to the Navy's submarine library in Groton, Connecticut. And every submarine that's ever been built has its own loose leaf binders of material from the time. And then there have also been a number of books written about that sinking, which have been really helpful. And then just general history, things that I learned growing up here. These are just some small excerpts from 2 whole novels. There's a lot of other things that go on, but and the inspiration for them, what I try to do is to make some sort of a personal connection, something where I could actually imagine myself remembering it as opposed to researching it and then just writing from that.
Do they have it at the library, or can we buy it locally?
The books? They're still, the novels are waiting for a publisher. This chapter that I just finished reading is going to be published next month in Britain, and it's available it will be available through my website. You can connect to Dark Mountain, and you can actually pre-order the book now, or order it later when it comes out. Thanks for asking. Yes?
Tony, I'm wondering, having grown up here, when you walk down the streets of Provincetown today, do you see ghosts? What do you see?
Yeah, well, it started there that morning in Loeb Square, but I've actually felt this way all along, and it seems to grow on me. It's the sense that this is one of the few places that that seems to have a living history instead of just being a theme park the way so many restored places are. The fact that you walk down Front Street, and except for the fact that it's paved and there's not a boardwalk, I mean, it's basically what it was in 1912. And the tradition of walking down the middle of the street is still firmly there. No matter how many cars from New Jersey try to break the tradition, but the 3 strains there were back then, and it's still continuing now. There was the older Yankee community. There was the overlay of the Portuguese immigrants, the fishermen. And then there's always, right from the beginning of Provincetown, been a Bohemian contingency, and those 3 have kept a wonderful dynamic going all through its Provincetown's history, which really make it very unique, as an editor would scratch out one or the other. Yeah, I mean.
Anyone else? Well, let's give a hand for Antonio Diaz.